that I have ever seen as part of our Oceans Caucus. So I yield the floor to Senator Murkowski.
Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I've had an opportunity to listen to a few moments of the comments from my colleague from Rhode Island. I clearly share his passion, his concern for the oceans. We've been working together as the co-chairman of the Oceans Caucus here in the Senate, and have had the opportunity to learn from one another on both ends of the country about the significance and the responsibilities that we have, also the great challenges that we have, whether it's ocean acidification, whether it is the opportunities that we have to ensure that we are good stewards of our water, our land, our air. It is a challenge that I think we face on a daily basis. But I think as we rise to meet these challenges, we recognize that oftentimes within the laws that we have put in place to provide for that level of protection, for that level of oversight and that stewardship, that we may encounter conflict with the obligation that we also have to ensure that the people that we represent have an opportunity for good jobs, for a livelihood in a region that they call home, that there is a level of balance that we find between our obligation to care for the land, the air, the water, as well as caring for one another. And it is in that vein, Mr. President, that I'd like to address my comments here this afternoon. I'd like to speak today about certain aspects of what we see within the Environmental Protection Agency and speak specifically to an issue that's unfolding in my state of Alaska. Clearly, the EPA has important responsibilities to set and to also enforce environmental standards. I think we would all agree with that. In the 40 years since EPA was established, our nation has made dramatic progress in restoring and preserving our environmental resources. I'm grateful, I'm proud to live in a nation with high environmental standards for the benefit of the land and for the people. But the process for setting federal environmental standards, I would suggest, Mr. President, is broken. We are seeing things present themselves not only in my state, but around the country. We see in Alaska day in and day out that things just aren't working, perhaps as they were designed. So many Alaskans feel that the EPA doesn't get Alaska. But the challenges I think that we see up north are just examples of many of the problems that we see repeated all over the nation. And I would suggest that what we need to see here is balance. Balance restored at the EPA. There's always been a recognition that the EPA must go about its work in a balanced way. Back in 1970, it was a memo called the Ash Memo, and it lists the origin of the EPA. And they stated it this way: sound environmental administration must reconcile divergent interests and serve the total public constituency. It must appreciate and take fully into account competing social and economic claims. Well, Mr. President, in recent years, EPA has not adequately, let alone fully, taken into account these so-called competing claims, such as the genuine welfare of our people and their economic needs. Now, EPA says, and I've had many a conversation with Administrator Jackson in person and before committee, where the statements are made that there's a concern about environmental justice for communities that are historically underrepresented in EPA decision-making. The fact is that many of those communities are very frequently the ones that bear the brunt of regressive increases in, for instance, in my state, in energy and in living costs that are caused by some of these rules that we are facing. When I go home, when I meet with people from around the country, I hear more complaints, more concerns expressed about the EPA than any other federal agency, bar none. And again, I'm told that the benefits of many of the EPA requirements are uncertain at best, but that the costs of the regulations are very real and they're detrimental to the human welfare. Today's EPA often seems too eager to impose requirements that are dubious in their health or their environmental benefits, but whose main effect may be to penalize or perhaps to even stop commerce or development. So restoring an appropriate equilibrium is vital if we want to have a healthy people, if we want to have a healthy economy. Today I'd like to speak to one example from my state, and this is as it relates to ECA. ECA is the reference to the emissions control area. The EPA was a major proponent of including the ocean off of southern and southeastern Alaska in an international emissions control area. This was an effort to reduce emissions from marine vessels through lowering sulfur standards within the fuel. The purpose of the emissions control areas is to require ships, which, to be very fair, certainly have significant emissions, require these ships to do their part to curb pollution. Absolutely reasonable. Absolutely reasonable. The problem that we're seeing up north is that EPA never gathered any air modeling data to support the claim that we've got a problem from ships that travel up to Alaska. So there has been no air modeling data whatsoever. We've requested. There has been none. Moreover, some of the proposals to work with the EPA, we need to be working with our agencies. We need our agencies to be working with us. But one of the proposals that was advanced was an offer for an equivalent method to comply with the ECA requirements in North America. In Juneau, Alaska, which is our state's capital, we are the only state in the country that is not accessible by road. Folks come and visit us by air, and they come in by ship in the summertime. Tourism is big business in Alaska. In Juneau, the ships that are tied up at the docks there are utilizing shoreside services so that there are no emissions when they are in the community. So one of the proposals that was out there, this equivalency method, it would essentially ask for a trade-off. If we have cruise ships that are emitting nothing when they are in dock or at shore, offset that against those emissions that would be emitted from those vessels that are out at sea, essentially, and averaging. That was rejected by the EPA. But what has made this particularly disconcerting for many Alaskans is the EPA's justification. In their justification, they cite a U.S. Forest Service study that purportedly found some evidence that emissions from cruise ships in southeast Alaska could impact the lichen in the mountains above Juneau. You see the mountains up there, they're pretty high. Well, there's lichen up on the top. It's kind of a short, mossy green. But the report then went on to worry that if we have impacted the lichen growth in Juneau, it could somehow or other harm the caribou. Well, Mr. President, never mind the link that lichen and cruise ship emissions may be very tenuous. There's a bigger problem with EPA's reasoning here. And anybody from Alaska would know that the problem is there's no caribou in Juneau, Alaska. There's no caribou anywhere in southeastern Alaska. You've all seen my pictures before. Alaska's a pretty big state, and if you're sitting here in Juneau, Alaska, to where the caribou herd are that this report was apparently concerned about, you're looking at over 1,000 miles between Juneau and where the southern Alaska Peninsula caribou herd cited in the EPA study lived. 1,000 miles. It would be as if you would make the claim or the assertion that a cruise ship that's sitting down in Miami might somehow or other affect the food for the bears that are up in the Pocono Mountains in north of Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. I think you need to look at this and recognize we've got a pretty flawed study here to begin with if the suggestion is we need to ensure that there's no emissions coming from a cruise ship in Juneau because it's going to impact the lichen, it's going to impact the caribou that don't happen to live anywhere near Juneau, no closer than 1,000 miles away. So applying these new fuel standards to save the lichen in Juneau, to feed the caribou 1,000 miles from here, will mean that the vessels that are plying these waters of southeast and south central Alaska, whether it's the freight ships, the freight vessels that move just about all of our goods, or whether it's the cruise ships that really are the lifeblood of the tourist economy, the requirement that they now burn low-sulfur diesel at levels that it is suggested are perhaps not attainable. So the question, I think, is fair to ask. You say, okay, what's the problem with requiring that that we make the cruise ships meet these standards, that we make the vessels that are bringing the goods north to Alaska? What's the problem with this requirement? Well, the problem is, while these ECA requirements may not have a measurable positive effect on human health or caribou food for that matter, it will have a material impact on our cost of living. Now, if you look at the state of Alaska, the way that we get our materials in, the way that we get our foodstuffs, our hardware, our lumber, it comes to us over the water. There's some, yes, that comes in by airplane, but you can be guaranteed that that's going to cost much more. There's some that can come up from the lower 48 across through Canada and into Alaska that way. But if you want to talk about increased emissions, that's sure one way to do it, is put it on truck and haul it all the way up here. So much of our goods come to the state by water. About 85% of the goods that come to the state of Alaska come into the Port of Anchorage, which is sitting right there. Now, what we see with these ECA regs is ships that may be coming out of ports such as Los Angeles or Long Beach, where my colleague from California, who is here on the floor, where she hails from, you've got hundreds of ships coming in and out every day, but they're not subject to the same emissions control area. They only need to burn this expensive low-sulfur fuel for a very short time until they're out of the ECA. But the problem is that when you're traveling along Alaska's coast to bring those goods up to our state, you're in an area where our air is pretty clean, our air is very pristine, but their entire voyage is within this ECA region, within this emissions control area. And so throughout that entire journey, they're required to burn the lower sulfur, more expensive fuel. Now, if this were just going to result in an increase in the price of a ticket increase in cost to the cruise lines or to the freight haulers that come up to the state, it might be one thing. But I think we recognize that the economic reality is every dime that's added to the cost of doing business in Alaska is ultimately going to be a dime that's passed on and shared by the consumers. The State of Alaska recently cited an estimate that these new requirements will increase the shipping costs to the State of Alaska by 8%. You'd say 8%, well, that's not that bad. You can live with that. The problem that we're facing is that in 2015, just around the corner, we're going to see an even higher standard that these vessels will be held to. And at that point in time, the suggestion is that costs could be increased by as much as 25%. Now, maybe that's on the high margin, but somewhere between 8 and 25%. Almost every commodity, again, that is consumed in our state is transported either by ship or by ship and plane, with the cost of freight adding a significant increase to every item that is out there. We're already one of the most expensive places to live in America, and rural Alaska is even more expensive. I check on a weekly basis to find out what Alaskans are paying for their fuel, whether it's in the city of Anchorage or up in Fairbanks or out in Kwethluk or in the villages, and I monitor that regularly to see how our communities are faring. In Kotzebue, for instance, this week, they're paying about $7.15 for a gallon of gas. I asked that we put a link on our website to get some pricing on what we're seeing in our communities as it relates to foodstuffs, things that you and I would use in our home here. Package that most of us recognize, 10-pound bag of sugar in Kwethluk is going for $17.25. There's no other store in Kwethluk other than the native store there, so it's not as if you can go down to a Safeway and comparison shop. It's not as if you can get in your car and drive to the city and see if you can get to Costco. It just doesn't happen. There's no roads in and out of Kwethluk. You might be able to take an airplane. A gallon of whole milk costs $30 in Ambler. That's if you can find whole milk or any kind of fresh milk. As a mom who has boys that go through laundry, I'm always looking to see what people are paying for laundry detergent. In Venati, a 100-ounce bottle of Tide goes for $43.50. I had my interns do a little price comparison on Tide. Powdered Tide, 56 ounces. In Anchorage, we're paying $9.98. That's a little bit higher than what you'd pay here in Washington. Washington is about $9. But in Angoon, that same box of Tide is $18.33. In Barrow, it's $22. In McGrath, it's $21. In Bethel, it's $21. So when we talk, Mr. President, about increasing the prices in Alaska, 8%, 10%, 12%, possibly 25%, when you're a mom buying a box of Tide and you're already paying $43, 8% starts to add up real quick. When you are trying to buy a bag of sugar so that you can make the food, put up the jam for the winter, and you're paying $17.25 in Kwethluk, I think it's fair to say we're paying attention to what happens when there are cost increases. EPA-mandated low-sulfur fuel is estimated to add $100 million in additional cost to the summer cruise traffic in Alaska. So you say, well, if you can afford the price of a cruise, not that big of a deal. You increase the price of the ticket and people will live. But what happens is this really puts Alaska in a competitive disadvantage when we're talking about where these businesses are going to operate. 14% of all employment in the state is directly tied to the tourism industry. So if the cruise lines can't pass on, fully pass on these increased costs, what they're going to do is they're going to move their ships. They're going to take them to other parts of the world where air quality standards are different. So what will then happen, we've got the loss of seasonal visitors. The money that they bring to southeastern Alaska is a huge part of the local economies, and also to the year-round institutions. In Juneau, our regional hospital is actually able to provide for a higher standard of care, in part because of the high influx of patients that it serves during the summertime. So, Mr. President, I would suggest that the EPA's one-size-fits-all approach to environmental regulation, perhaps just you can't quite shoehorn that in all situations, and we need to be aware of that. I think when we talk about the concept of environmental justice, we need to make sure that in an effort to provide for a level of regulation and rules that are imposed, that we are not hurting the most vulnerable. And I would suggest to you the people in Kwethluk that are looking at the impact of these regulations and what it's going to mean to them in their village, and they're asking me, how do we survive? How do we live? And the answer isn't to move to Washington, D.C. That's not the answer here. It takes us back to balance. So what's happening in the state right now, the state of Alaska has sued the EPA administrator in federal court to stop the new requirements from taking into effect. And given the immediacy of the threat that these requirements pose to my state, I think that the state's move to advance the litigation was the right one. But we shouldn't have to sue our own government in order to get balanced regulation. The administrator, Lisa Jackson, has recently acknowledged that applying ECA to Alaska posed a problem. She recognized that. But unfortunately, we haven't seen more beyond those words because we're still no closer to a solution. These new requirements are set to take effect next week, the initial threshold. I've been raising this issue with EPA for several years, but again, we're still working and we have not yet resolved it. So I have called on the President for himself to marshal the State Department to see if ECA can be amended or some other relief can be found to eliminate at least this one burden. This, again, Mr. President, this is something that is touching Alaskans in a very immediate and a very, very direct way. We want to ensure that our air is clean, that our water is clean. We want to be the good custodians and stewards of our land, and we are. But we need to be able to work with our federal regulators. And so I've asked the administrator, I asked the President, work with us on this. And, Mr. President, I know that my colleague from California is here to speak, but I would like the indulgence of the body for just 2 more minutes to speak on I think, a little bit of a happy occasion. Tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, excuse me, on Saturday, Alaskans are going to be celebrating Ted Stevens Day, and I would like to just make a few comments for the record. As I travel around the state, whether I'm in Fairbanks or down on the Kenai River or up in Bethel, down in Ketchikan, everywhere I go, I am reminded of my good friend and the friend of so many in this body, Senator Ted Stevens. It was nearly 2 years ago now that we lost Uncle Ted to the tragic plane crash in southwest Alaska. But as tragic as that was, I always stop to remember that that tragedy struck while Ted was doing what he loved to do most, which was enjoying Alaska's great outdoors, going fishing, just being outdoors. His passion for Alaska's unique wilderness, his love for fishing, his immense affection for the outdoors really embodies the spirit that we're now advancing in Ted Stevens Day. And the motto of this day is, get out and play. And so on the 4th Saturday of July, we joined together to celebrate the life and the legacy of a man who's really dedicated to public service, whether it was his days as a pilot in World War II to the 4 decades that he served with us here in the United States Senate. He began working in Alaska long before statehood. When he came here to Washington, D.C. to represent us in the United States Senate, he began a battle for our state that lasted for 40 years. He fought for roads, for buildings, for infrastructure that new young states need, as well as many of the programs that are in place today that continue on. And he worked to transform not only Alaska, but really the rest of the country as well. It's somewhat coincidental that this Ted Stevens Day coincides with the beginning of the 2012 Summer Olympic Games in London. So as Alaskans get together to get out and play this weekend under the midnight sun, there's going to be 530 American athletes who will begin to embark on a 17-day Olympic journey that Senator Stevens helped to pioneer. It's because of legislation that he championed that the Olympic movement in the United States exists as it does today. Back in '78, he fought for the passage of the Olympic and Amateur Sports Act. This was later renamed the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act. In his honor, it was declared the U.S. Olympic Committee the centralized body of all Olympic activities in the country, and ultimately led to the creation of national governing bodies responsible for the oversight of each individual Olympic sport, a structure that is still in place now. He really was so much an inspiration to the progress and to the development of the Olympic movement here in the United States. Earlier this month, the U.S. Olympic Committee honored Senator Stevens as a special contributor to the class of 2012 U.S. Olympic Hall of Fame. And we all know that Senator Stevens was also a huge proponent of Title IX. I think he would be very proud that for the first time in American history, Team USA is comprised of more women than men. I think that would give him a smile. But this feat was made possible by the landmark legislation passed 40 years ago, which opened those gymnasium doors and leveled the playing field for women and girls across country. In Alaska, we very often say that Ted Stevens was larger than life. And today, discussing this, bringing this up, recognizing that on Saturday we're going to continue a tradition of remembering a man who loved Alaska with a passion. And as we go out and bike and hike and fishing, I think many will share good memories of an amazing Alaskan, an amazing man, and truly an amazing American. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak for a few minutes about a subject that should hopefully bring a smile to many of us. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, I wish to speak on the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, so I assume that bill is in order and on the floor.
The motion to proceed is pending.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I come to the floor as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee to, in my own way, indicate the seriousness of the job that we are about to begin. I know there's controversy, I know there are differences of opinion, but what people have to understand is that we have breach after breach now, and they are becoming far more numerous, much more sophisticated, and much more insidious in recent years. I want to give a number of examples of what is happening out there in the real world. And let me begin by going back to 2008, when the Pentagon's classified military computer networks suffered a, quote, significant compromise, end quote. Now, that's according to the former Deputy Secretary Bill Lynn in 2010. These breaches are usually classified at the time they happen. Therefore, people don't know about them. So all I'm going to do are run through unclassified breaches. And even that is beyond, I think, comprehension. Former Secretary Lin also detailed that foreign hackers sold 24,000 United States military files in a single attack on a defense contractor in March of 11. In the 5 months from October 11 through February 12, over 50,000 cyber attacks were reported on private and governmental networks, with 86 of those attacks taking place on critical infrastructure networks. Now, that's according to the Bipartisan Policy Center's Cybersecurity Task Force. 50,000 incidents were the ones that were reported to the Department of Homeland Security. So they represent only a small fraction of the cyber attacks carried out against the United States. In December of 11, press reports revealed that the networks of the United States Chamber of Commerce were completely penetrated for more than a year by hackers. The hackers apparently had access to everything in chamber computers, including member company communications and industry positions on United States trade policy. In March of 2011, NASA's Inspector General reported that cyber attacks successfully compromised NASA computers. In one attack, intruders stole 150 user credentials that could be used to gain unauthorized access into the NASA systems. Another attack at the Joint Propulsion Center, JPL, involved China-based Internet Protocol, IP addresses. Let the intruders gain full access to key JPL systems and sensitive user accounts. 48 companies in the chemical, defense, and other industries were penetrated during 2011 for at least 6 months by a hacker looking for intellectual property. The cybersecurity company Symantec attributes some of these attacks to computers in Hebei, China. It became worldwide news when Google alleged in April of 11 that China had compromised hundreds of Gmail passwords for email accounts of prominent people, including senior United States officials. On March 17, 2011, RSA publicly disclosed that it had detected a very sophisticated cyber attack on its systems in an attempt to obtain data that would compromise RSI's authenticated login technology. That data acquired was then used in an attempt to penetrate Lockheed Martin's networks. Between March of 2010 and April of 2011, the FBI identified 20 incidents in which the online banking credentials of small to medium-sized United States businesses were compromised and used to initiate wire transfers to Chinese economic and trade companies. As of April of 2011, the total attempted fraud amounts to approximately $20 million. The actual victim losses are $11 million. In October 2010, hackers penetrated the systems of NASDAQ, which sparked concerns about the severity of cyber threat facing the financial industry. In January 2011, a hacker extracted $6.7 million from South Africa's Postbank over the New Year's holiday. In January 2011, hackers penetrated the European Union's carbon trading market, which allows organizations to buy and sell their carbon emissions quotas and steal more than $7 million in credits, forcing the market to shut down temporarily. An international commuter crime ring broke up in October of 2010, siphoned about $70 million in a hacking operation targeting bank accounts of small businesses, municipalities, and churches, according to the FBI. In November 2008, hackers breached networks at the Royal Bank of Scotland's WorldPay, allowing them to clone 100 ATM cards and withdraw over $9 million from machines in 49 cities. In December 2008, retail giant TJX was hacked. The one hacker captured and convicted, named Maxim Yastremski, is said to have made $11 million from the hack. In August 2008, computer networks in Georgia were hacked by unknown foreign intruders, most likely at the behest of the Russian government, because they were coordinated with Russian military actions against Georgia. In May 2007, Estonian government networks were harassed by a denial-of-service attack by unknown foreign intruders, most likely, again, at the behest of the Russian government, because they were part of a dispute between the two countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So as you can see from some of the examples above, for years now, the United States and other countries have been at the receiving end of multiple concerted efforts by nation-states and non-state actors to hack into our networks. These bad actors are infiltrating our communications, they're accessing our secrets, they're sapping our economic health by stealing intellectual property. They may also be building a capability, if necessary in the future, to wage cyber war. We may not even know until the attack has been launched. These attacks are sophisticated, and they involve hacking techniques that we unfortunately now see quite often. Cyber attacks can come in forms of viruses and worms, malicious backdoors, logic bombs, and denial-of-service attacks, just to name a few. A groundbreaking, unclassified report from November of last year, published by the intelligence community, said cyber intrusions against United States companies cost billions of dollars annually, and the report named China and Russia as aggressive cyber thieves. On China, the report said, and I quote, "Chinese actors are the most active and persistent perpetrators of economic espionage," end quote. We know that sophisticated attacks from China against financial and technology companies such as Google resulted in property theft on a massive scale. Billions of dollars of trade secrets, technology, and intellectual property are being siphoned each year from the United States to benefit the economies of China and other countries. On Russia, the report said, and I quote, "Russia's intelligence services are conducting a range of activities to collect economic information and technology from United States targets." I can assure you, Mr. President, that the classified assessments are far more descriptive and far more devastating. The examples are bad enough, but cyber threats are evolving, and I'm very concerned that the next wave will come in the form of crippling intrusions against the computers that control power plants, dams, transportation hubs, and financial networks in these United States. We have already seen the use of cyber attacks in warfare when hackers inside Russia reportedly took down the command and control systems in Estonia in 2007. And that was 5 years ago, roughly a lifetime ago in the realm of cyber attack capability. Senior national security experts from across the political spectrum have sounded the alarm about this threat. Leon Panetta, at his confirmation hearing to be Secretary of Defense, the next Pearl Harbor we confront could very well be a cyber attack that cripples our power systems, our grid, our security systems, our financial systems, our governmental systems. Bob Mueller testified, the cyber threat, which cuts across all programs, will be the #1 threat to our country. We are dealing with the #1 threat to our country. I am pleased to be an original co-sponsor of the Cybersecurity Act of 2012 with Senators Lieberman, Collins, Rockefeller, and Carper. And I'd really like to thank them for their tireless work on this legislation over the past several years. This act has 7 titles. Each of them addresses a key gap in our nation's cyber laws. I'd like to just take a moment to describe the critical infrastructure provisions in Title I, but I'd like to focus most of my remarks on the information sharing part of the bill, which make up Title VII. Title I covers critical infrastructure protection, which means protecting the public and private infrastructure that underpin our economy and our way of life. A big, big deal. A cyber attack against these networks could open a dam, crash our financial system, or disable the grid. It could stop all planes. It could interrupt the FAA. On and on and on. Although some critical infrastructure companies have taken action to protect their networks, I must tell you many of them have not. It appears that market forces are insufficient for many critical infrastructure companies to adopt adequate cybersecurity practices. Thus, Title I of this bill would create strong incentives for companies to work with the federal government to establish standards for critical infrastructure protection. Now, let me be candid. Even though the bill makes cybersecurity standards voluntary, I know senators still resist this idea. I do not. I would have preferred that this bill include its original critical infrastructure provisions, which would have mandated baseline standards for cybersecurity. But I recognize that we've got to compromise. I recognize that this legislation is a necessary first step to provide some security, and compromise to the voluntary measures in the bill was necessary. So we've done it. And I hope that if and when we see a major cyber attack against the power grid or Wall Street or a major dam, we won't see this compromise as a mistake. Other senators have spoken at length about critical infrastructure and other parts of the bill. So let me move to Title VII regarding information sharing. This is the part that the Intelligence Committee has had something to do with it. This title, at 40 pages of the bill, covers authorities and protections for sharing information about threats to cybersecurity. The information sharing title addresses one of the main problems I've heard from both the private sector and the government about existing laws and business practices when it comes to cyber. And that is that private sector companies and the government know a lot about the cyber attacks against their networks. But this information is so stovepiped that no one is as well protected as they could be if the information were shared. That, I believe, is fact. As the bipartisan cybersecurity task force recently found, and I quote, "Despite general agreement that we need to do it, cyber information sharing is not meeting the needs of today." So Title VII addresses this problem. It reduces the legal barriers which hamper a private entity's ability to work with others and the federal government to share threat information. Now, how do we do this? What does that title do specifically? First, it explicitly authorizes companies to monitor and defend their own networks. Many companies monitor and defend their own networks today, in order to protect themselves and their customers. But we have heard from numerous companies that the law in the area is unclear and that sometimes it's less risky from a financial perspective for them to allow attacks to happen than to take additional steps to defend that. Can you imagine that? To defend themselves. So we make the law clear by giving companies explicit authority to monitor and defend their own networks and make the law clear. Secondly, the bill authorizes the sharing of cyber threat information among private companies. There have been concerns that antitrust laws prevent companies from cooperating on cyber defense. This bill, in Section 702, clearly says, and I quote, "Notwithstanding any other provision of law, any private entity may disclose lawfully obtained cybersecurity threat indicators to any other private entity in accordance with this section." Third, the bill authorized the government, which will largely mean in practice the intelligence community, I hope the DNI, to share classified information about cyber threats with appropriately cleared organizations outside of the government. Now, traditionally, only government employees and contractors have been eligible to receive security clearances and therefore gain access to national secrets. To put it another way, those with a valid need to know most security secrets are within the government. That isn't true, though, for cybersecurity. In this case, we can't restrict classified information tightly within government. The companies that underpin our nation's economy and way of life have a need to know about the nature of cyber attacks so they can better secure their systems. It's not sufficient for the government to be able to defend itself against an attack. It's also necessary for companies like Google or an institution like NASDAQ to be able to protect themselves and to use all possible defenses that we can help them provide. So under this bill, companies are able to qualify to receive classified information. They will be certified and then able to obtain classified information about what cyber threats to look out for. Fourth, the bill establishes a system through which any private sector entity, whether a power utility, a defense contractor, a telecom company, or others, can share cyber threat information with the government. When it comes to cyber, information sharing must be a two-way street. Oftentimes, the private sector has important information about cyber intrusions that the government doesn't possess. After all, the private sector is the one on the front lines of incoming cyber assault, so companies are often best able to understand the attack. The private sector should be able to share that information with the government so that the government can protect itself and fulfill its responsibility to warn others about the threat. So let me describe how this bill allows for and encourages that information sharing. And most importantly, let me describe the liability protections that companies receive for doing so. The Secretary of Homeland Security, in consultation with the Attorney General, the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, would designate one or more federal cybersecurity exchanges. We envision that these exchanges would be an existing entity, such as one of the existing federal cybersecurity centers. Private companies would share cyber threat information with these exchanges directly. These exchanges must be civilian entities, important to a number of senators, and they will have procedures in place to share that information as quickly as possible with other parts of the government. The information is protected from disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. It cannot be used in a regulatory enforcement action. This exchange would serve as a focal point for information sharing with the government. Having a single focal point would establish a single point of contact for the private sector. Otherwise, you have chaos. Some people want multiple points. It's difficult to do and maintain the security that's necessary. We think this approach solves the problem. Having a single point is also more efficient for the government. It would help eliminate stovepipes because right now there are dozens of different parts of the government receiving information from the private sector about cyber threats they're encountering. It's all over the map. It would also make privacy and civil liberties oversight easier, which I know interests you, Mr. President, and I will describe that in a moment. Finally, it should save taxpayers money because it's more efficient to manage, and that's got to be a concern, and to oversee the operation of one entity versus many entities. Let me now describe the all-important liability protections that are such a critical part of this. Section 706 of the bill provides liability protection for the voluntary sharing of cyber threat information with the Federal Exchange. The bill reads, and I quote, "No civil or criminal cause of action shall lie or be maintained in any federal or state court against any entity," that means a company, "acting as authorized by this title. And any such action shall be dismissed promptly for the voluntary disclosure of a lawfully obtained cybersecurity threat indicator to a cybersecurity exchange." That's Section 706A. It is clear as a bell. In other words, a company is immune from a lawsuit over sharing cyber threat information with a federal exchange. The same immunity applies to the following: companies who monitor their own networks, cybersecurity companies who share threat information with their customers, companies that share information with a critical infrastructure owner or operator, companies who share threat information with other companies, so long as they also share that information with the Federal Exchange within a reasonable time. This reasonable good faith defense is also available for the use of defensive countermeasures. If a company shared information in a way other than the 5 ways I've just mentioned, it still receives a legal defense under this bill from suit if the company can make a reasonable good faith showing that the information sharing provisions permitted that sharing. Further, no civil or criminal cause of action can be brought against a company, an officer, an employee, or agency of a company for the reasonable failure to act on information received through information sharing mechanisms set up by this bill. Basically, and this is important, please listen, the only way that anyone participating in the information sharing system can be held liable is if they were found to have knowingly violated a provision of the bill or acted in gross negligence. So there are very strong liability protections for anyone that shares information about cyber threats, which is completely voluntary under this bill. Now, what information will be shared with the exchange? Information that should be shared includes, but is not limited to, malware threat signatures, known malicious protocol IP addresses, immediate cyber attack incident details, The exchanges would be able to share this information in as close to real time as possible over networks. And that's the only way for the private sector and the government to stay a step ahead of our cyber adversaries. Now, what kind of information can they share? We define this information in our bill as cybersecurity threat indicators. We define this term to include only information that is reasonably necessary to describe the technical attributes of cyber attacks. This is not a license for the government to take in and distribute private citizens' information. Rather, it's a narrowly tailored element to cover information that relates specifically to a cyber attack. In addition to narrowly defining what information can be shared with an exchange, our bill also requires the federal government to adopt very robust privacy and civil liberties oversight in a regime for information shared under this title. There are multiple layers of oversight from different parts of the executive branch, including the Department of Justice, the Independent Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, as well as the Congress. I would like to direct members to the privacy and civil liberties protections on pages 185 and 192 of this bill for the litany of procedures, reviews, and reports that are required. We have worked closely with several senators, including yourself, Mr. President, Senators Durbin, Coons, Akaka, Blumenthal, and Saunders on these protections. And I really thank you all for your efforts in that regard. I think you've really helped the bill become a better bill. I'd also be remiss if I didn't know my great appreciation of the work and leadership of the Majority Leader for his unrelenting focus on getting this bill to the floor and making time to have this debate. It is infinitely better having this debate now than after a major cyber attack. And my greatest worry is that we won't pass something. The perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. This legislation is unprecedented. It'll take some steps. We will find other steps that we will need to take. We will need to come back to it and back to it because technology is moving so quickly. I think this is as important a bill as I've seen in my 20 years in the Senate. I know what's out there. I know what some other countries are doing. I know what some bad actors are doing. And the time has come to protect ourselves and take some action. I hope we will have the support, and I urge my colleagues to vote for this bill. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am here today to express my sincere appreciation and thanks and admiration to a number of our distinguished Foreign Service officers who were similarly lauded by Senator McCain earlier today. I heard his remarks and I wish to be associated with them in expressing my thanks to three very brave and able men who have served this country under the most demanding and difficult conditions, requiring huge personal courage, as well as insight and strong action. They are Ryan Crocker, who has served as ambassador to Afghanistan, his deputy, who will replace him shortly, James Cunningham, and our ambassador to Pakistan, Cameron Munter. What they share and what they have given us in these two critical posts are the best of our nation's public service and foreign service. I had occasion to meet both Ambassador Crocker and Ambassador Cunningham on a number of visits to Afghanistan, and to be briefed by both of them. And so I know personally how extraordinarily honest and forthright they are in the insight and intelligence that they give to congressional visitors, and many of us have been among those visitors, and many of us have met with them, and so I know that others have had that experience as well. I know them both to be extremely capable and intelligent, thoughtful, and insightful. They understand the complexities of this region, and they have succeeded in maintaining strong relationships with our partners in Afghanistan and Pakistan to the extent that they were able to do so amid the most complex and challenging circumstances. And somehow, in between all of the challenges they faced on the ground, day to day, they also welcomed congressional visitors with extraordinary grace and graciousness and generosity. And I was proud to be one of them in visiting both Pakistan and Afghanistan. I'd like to recognize particularly the efforts of Ambassador Munter in addressing the supply chain of IED, improvised explosive device ingredients, the fertilizer and other chemicals that compose the roadside bombs that have literally caused more than half of our nation's casualties in Afghanistan. Those ingredients are smuggled and sometimes in broad daylight, visibly across the border from Pakistan. He has worked hard and made a valuable contribution in challenging the government of Pakistan to do better and to confront the threat and to ensure interagency coordination between the Department of State and the Department of Defense in confronting and attacking the IED network. He has written to me personally, and I thank him for his commitment to a cause that others have made also a priority, such as Dr. Ashley Carter, presently Deputy Secretary of Defense. And together, we've worked on this issue and made progress, but so much more must be done to stop the flow of IED bomb-making material across the border, which does such horrific destructive damage to our troops. And one need only visit the Bethesda Naval Center to see it firsthand. And our hearts go out to the young men, principally men and women, and their families who are victims of these bombs. Thank you to Ambassador Munter for making it a priority. Thank you to Ambassador Crocker, likewise, for working on this problem as he led the embassy in Kabul through profoundly and deeply challenging times. When we here in Washington revise our policy toward Afghanistan, and as we go through those revisions now, he has adapted, he's carried out policies, and he has served well our national interest, even in the midst of change and challenge. I welcome Deputy Ambassador Cunningham to his new post. I have worked and been briefed by him, in fact, stayed with him in the embassy, and seen his keen insight, his quiet, understated manner, but his strength and will. And indeed, all of these men are men of intellect, but they're also men of action, committed to deliver results to the nation, men of loyalty and courage. And I would just finish on this note. Nobody should underestimate the courage that is required to serve in these positions. Anyone who has visited these countries know that the threat of physical danger is ever present, not only to the brave men and women who serve in uniform in our armed forces, but to our diplomats who every day put their lives on the line to serve us. And so I thank not only them, but the thousands of men and women who have served with them in Afghanistan and Pakistan and other countries in postings in places whose names most Americans can barely pronounce. They have demonstrated the kind of bravery that Ambassadors Crocker, Munter, and Cunningham have every day. And they deserve our thanks and our good wishes as they leave their present posts, as Ambassador Crocker retires, and our good wishes for continued success for the sake of their lives and for the sake of our nation. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.